Yeah, thank you very much. I hope it's not only because I'm your boss. I hope to convince by good arguments rather by sheer power. And we have a very interesting topic in this evening, the funding for translational or the mechanisms for translational research on the national and European level. And I'm very happy to, in this context, to represent the Biomed Alliance. The Biomed Alliance is a group of the big medical organizations in Europe, like the European Society for Cardiology, Oncology, and so forth. Overall 400,000 members, so it's a large group of people all devoted at different positions to translation. So with that, I start the meeting, and I would like to introduce the speakers and panelists to you. And the first, I'm very grateful, is Martin Seychell, Deputy Director General in Health and Food Safeties, Directorate General, in short, Santé, at the European Commission. Please give him a warm welcome. He made it to Berlin despite some travel problems which are around. So we are very happy that he's here. The next one, also a speaker, will be Georg Duda, the head of the Julius Wolff Institute at the Charité, and also the, one of the chairpersons of the BIH Regeneration. Georg, take a seat. And then I have the very big pleasure also to announce to you my boss, which is Veronika von Messling, and she's Director General at the Life Science Division at the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Germany. Hello, please. The fourth panelist is Bernd Stowasser, Senior Director of Prospective and Strategic Initiatives of Sanofi Aventis, and a number of other things which are too long to read it here. So please take a seat. And last not least is Ulrich Dirnagl, Founding Director of the BIH Quest Center, which is devoted to increasing quality, sustainability, and value of research. Please. So thank you all very much for coming. I hope we will have a very lively and not controversial, but evoking debate. And to start that all up, the first speaker is Martin Seychell, who will give an introduction on the topic EU future priorities in health and research. Please, Martin. Wherever you want. You can sit, you can stand, okay. You can run around.
Try to do it less formally. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here. And let me just start by saying that the European Commission is very proud of the role played by researchers, innovators in the area of health, because that's where I work. And we are at a very important time to really emphasize that. As you know, we are on the eve of a new commission taking office, a new mandate, a new financial perspective, the new programs. Horizon Europe, as you know, will further develop what we have been developing over the years, the collaboration between researchers, academics, but now we need to go also further. We need to have a greater involvement of health professionals, patients, civil society representatives, health systems in particular, and public health authorities to make sure we can not only continue to have excellent research, but take the results of research also to patients, to health systems, so that we can all benefit more from them. As you know, the Commission has proposed an ambitious budget for Horizon Europe, an increased budget for research. The proposal for the period 21-27 is 100 billion, of which almost 8 billion euros are earmarked for health. And this is not, of course, the entire story where health is concerned, but these are specifically earmarked for health. We're also introducing in Horizon Europe new tools. You may have heard of the missions, of course, which kind of are portfolio of projects on a specific team, coordinated to achieve results that are bold, but also in a period of time, timely results. We also would like to see, for the next 7 years, a greater synergy between different policies and different programs. So we should not see the research program on its own, but how the research program can also work with other programs as well on specific topics of priority. And above all, we need to encourage a faster uptake of the results of research and innovation. You will hear a lot more in the coming years about the word implementation, and this is absolutely key. Now, speaking about the area of health, we're also, of course, looking into using other powerful programs, the European Social Fund Plus, for example, which can ensure that wherever relevant, health aspects are fully integrated in all social spending. The EU structural funds, the EU investment fund, because in the area of health and particularly in the implementation of research, there are often big investment challenges, which of course Europe is well placed to address. For example, we can, through these instruments, incentivize further public-private partnerships to share risk, but also to really pool resources when it comes to research and innovation. Let me just give a few examples very briefly of where we see some of the priorities, at least which are clearly on everyone's radar screen. Let me start by emphasizing once again, we realize we are already in the middle of a new technological revolution when it comes to healthcare. The applications in the fields of genomics, artificial intelligence, data, digital, will radically change the way various industries develop products, conduct trials, and how we use those products as well. The whole point of the digital transformation is not just, of course, to do digitally what was previously done in a, let's say, more analog manner, but to completely transform the way things are done. And we do need that transformation in healthcare. Now, we start off from a very good position. If I take, for example, EU biopharma companies, they are world leaders in knowledge production and investment. They are major contributors to the EU economy and account for over 70% of the R&D pipeline in pharmaceuticals. Yet, we have challenges. The success rate of any clinical development averages around 14%. We know, of course, these are very challenging areas, but it is quite a difficult task. And our policies have to accommodate an industry whose products may be developed today, but may enter the market only, say, in 2030, because the lead time is very, very long. This is why it's really important to work upstream, to merge scientific disciplines and other areas at an early stage of research. We need to be much better at identifying, for example, the areas where there are the greatest research needs. We have a lot of unmet needs, even major unmet needs in healthcare. And those need to be prioritized so that we can early on also not just incentivize the research in those areas, but also prepare the ground for the adoption of the research results when they do come through. In the area of pharmaceuticals, for example, this means not only developing new therapies for these unmet needs, we also need to work upstream on the business model. How we're going to reduce the cost of medicines and ensure access when those technologies eventually come through. Because having wonderful solutions that are not accessible to the bulk of Europe's population is obviously not acceptable. So that is something which needs to be factored in. And to do that, we need to involve regulators, academia, healthcare professionals, health system managers. All of those are key. We also need to develop new partnerships, new types of partnerships that involve both private and public actors. And Horizon Europe, in fact, is a key instrument for doing that. We know we have challenges in Europe. We are very good, I would say, at the earlier stages of research. I think we are very good there. But we all know that when we look at the entire chain, the R&D and knowledge gained from these processes often does not turn into products that are also produced in the EU. We know that sometimes for many reasons, often for investment reasons, but others as well, those products are brought to the market elsewhere. And often it's because in those other jurisdictions, the startup culture and the conditions for product development are more favorable. And this is something we have to work on here in Europe. We need also to think about what are the right incentives for innovation. Incentives for innovation should be strong enough to foster investment, return on investment, but must also allow for catering of unmet needs and ensuring access. This is fundamental also in the political debate currently underway in Europe. And we cannot talk about innovation without also talking about access and vice versa. The two are interlinked. And therefore, the Commission is looking at and examining how various incentives have worked. We have had over the years incentives, for example, for rare diseases, for orphan products, for pediatric medicines. We're also looking at whether any adjustments are needed, new or different incentives for certain areas, also incentives for access, which we don't have. How could you ensure that? And how could you link the incentives for innovation with incentives for access? We also need to find ways to support interdisciplinary cooperation between industry, academia, and healthcare providers. Because, of course, innovation also needs to find a favorable environment that can actually take up those results. And this means we have to foster long-term relationships between universities, research centers, and industry, including innovative funding models and startup financing. Now, all this is only possible maybe if we also tackle at the same time and fully utilize the advances in digital health. I would like to say a few words about this because the digital health revolution is fundamentally reshaping the way how health and care are delivered and will be delivered in the EU and will have implications for patients, healthcare providers, researchers, and health systems alike. At the center of this, of course, is the fact that health systems generate large amounts of high-quality data, generated by highly trained professionals in very well-regulated settings. That's a starting point. And yet we know the health sector, compared to other sectors, is lagging behind in the utilization, the systematic utilization and exploitation of this data. We need to, therefore, have a very good, robust mechanism for accessing, using, and sharing health data, which we all know is, of course, the most sensitive of data, but still the most valuable also, but also joining health data with other types of data, data from the social area, data from the environmental area. This is also important, it's like a big data approach. All this is very valuable for research. And if we do not take action now, Europe is at a serious risk of being left behind because other jurisdictions are moving very fast on this and they are moving at an impressive rate. And we have to follow and catch up. The Commission is very conscious that the key condition for this to happen is trust. You cannot have any successful digital transformation without a high level of trust. So building public trust that health data, when shared, will be handled securely and following ethical standards is essential. And we need to have also a robust framework to ensure that health data is not abused for other purposes, sometimes non-health purposes. This is really important. But this is not a reason to stop this transformation. It's all the more reason to actually master it and do it in the right way. As you know, we have been working already for some years on the digital transformation of health and care. We are already witnessing a lot of progress. Countries are already now starting to exchange healthcare data. I'd like to say, so far, it's mostly the smaller countries that are doing this. So I would like also to encourage and see how we can encourage larger countries also have more data to also exchange. We have started, for example, in some countries exchanging e-prescriptions, patient summaries. We are now moving on to lab results, discharge letters, and imaging results. All this, of course, requires, for example, interoperability and standards. Otherwise, it will become too complicated to do properly. And above all, digital has the potential, when it transforms healthcare, to also help us address another issue, which is very fundamental for Europe. We need to reduce the inequalities in healthcare and outcomes. Within countries, across countries, there are major inequalities, even on basic things like life expectancy. 10 years sometimes in a single city, depending on which part of the city you live in. And digital, if done properly, can make location much less relevant. But of course, if done wrongly, it could end up making location even more relevant. So that is something, obviously, which we need to tackle together. And that's an area where, of course, as you know, the Commission has launched another program, a new program for the next financial period, which is the Digital Europe program, which is designed actually to help also ensure that we don't have digital divide in Europe, which could also become a health divide, depending on who has access and who doesn't to digital technologies. There are a lot of other priorities. As you know, I would invite you all to read the mission letter which President-elect von der Leyen has sent to the Health Commissioner designate. It speaks about a lot of things, the European health data space. the challenge of antimicrobial resistance, the challenge of falling vaccination rates in Europe, but also the need to ensure access to medicines. So it's a very ambitious health agenda, but we cannot do this alone. I mean, the Commission, as you know, in the area of health has mainly a supporting role. We have, of course, competences in some areas where we have obligations and we have responsibilities, but in general in health we work in partnership with member states, with industry of various sizes and shapes, with professionals, and above all with patient organizations. And we also need to systematically identify major gaps. We should not be complacent about things. For example, in recent years, there's been a lot of attention, of course, rightly so, on the non-communicable diseases, which are 80% of the health burden. But let's not forget, we are seeing a resurgence in some cases of infectious diseases, sometimes in a drug-resistant form. All the diseases that have never gone away, things like tuberculosis, malaria, which is expanding its range, vector-borne diseases, expanding their range because of climate change. We need to be prepared for all this. This needs research. It needs new knowledge, it needs new products, it needs new approaches to be able to tackle that. Even things like surveillance and epidemiology will need to be revolutionized by this digital revolution. We also need new economic models. In some cases, the problems that we see with access and with lack of access are due to business models which are not right, the right business models. We see a growing tension. You know, on the one hand, the very expensive, innovative drugs that most countries struggle to afford and, you know, hitting the headlines all the time with, for example, the area of gene therapy. But we also see problems with the disappearance from the market of cheap generic products, disappearing because it is not viable for anyone to produce something at that point. So these are issues which call for also for new business models. And there are a lot of data and research gaps. We don't know, for example, enough about antimicrobial resistance, the role the environment plays, the residues in the environment. We have a lack of data there. We have a lack of full understanding about things like the epidemiology of cancer. Why is it that some cancers are becoming, let's say, more prevalent? Is that really the case? And if so, can we link that to certain environmental or other issues? So, indeed, I mentioned cancer because I would like to highlight one aspect. As you know, one of the issues in the mission letter from the President-elect is, and a very strong desire from the European Parliament, is the idea to have a European action plan and also a research mission on cancer. Why cancer? Because cancer, first of all, is becoming rapidly the most significant cause of mortality, but also the failures in the area of cancer, although there have been a lot of successes, the failures are very typical of the failures of health systems as a whole. The fact that we are poor in prevention, that we often diagnose things late, we don't have effective ways of reaching people for screening. So lots of areas where actually research can play a role, but it's also important then, and this is really something I cannot emphasize enough, to take the results of research into health systems, and that also requires health systems need to be prepared for that change. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we can have a good discussion on some of these points at least. Thank you.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to discuss there, and a lot of food for thought also. And it's also a lot of linkage to what Georg Duda will now tell us about mechanisms which are needed for translation. Georg.
Yeah, I think I'm using this here. So it's a great pleasure to introduce a little bit the thoughts that we have on changing the mindset in life sciences to be more translational. We heard a lot of examples today about what could be translational, and I'm pretty sure everybody here in the audience is well aware of what is really required to be translational. And it is, for us, something that really reaches the patient and really impacts the way how treatment is done. It doesn't need to be completely new. It could be just changing the way how treatment is done. Translation is, however, definitely something where different disciplines work together. It is then something that usually takes a long period of time. It's usually not very short. And it is an intrinsic knowledge-generating process. So it's research by itself because we see if something actually works in patients. And we call that then refined translation because we go back from the bench or from the patient back to the bench and forward to the patient. Germany and university medicine, I feel, is relatively good positioned in that setting because we have academia and basic science and clinical translation in the same building and same infrastructure. But there is a global race for the best possible model. Lots of institutions and initiatives are at the moment trying to find the best possible translational chain. In that sense, we have organized with Science Translation a couple of events trying to find on a global level a consensus what we need and what do we think is translation and how to actually go forward. It's definitely not simply putting the word translation in front of everything that you do. It's also not simply having a clinician scientist and put that clinician scientist together with a basic scientist and say, now make translation. It is innovation that really targets to reach the patient, and sometimes, and we heard that just recently, it is important to simply also characterize the medical need and really understand as a basis to what we want to translate, what is actually needed, and how do we tackle that. In that sense, it is highly important to start with understanding the unmet medical need, and I deeply believe, and at least the fields that I'm researching, in a number of cases we're not really aware of what actually the problem is, or we don't understand the problem good enough. So we need more understanding on that. And we frequently have great technologies, and we already think about where to apply them. But if these things, the understanding of the need and the new technology, if they don't really match to each other, you easily see that there is a high risk that the translation later will be has a very small chance to actually reach the result and actually be reality. In that sense, we just recently have formulated from the German Research Foundation a basic understanding or basic formulation of what translation actually means in Germany for university medicine and how German university medicine could eventually change and adapt to be really ready for translation. One thing that I thought when I heard a couple of presentations earlier today, and was just indicated also very early on opportunity check. What is the value that I actually aim for? How expensive can a solution eventually be to target? What are the competing other and alternatives? And what am I with my solution sort of benchmarked against in the end would be helpful to have in the beginning. We did that wrong in a number of cases and had that discussion only at the end, once we had the patents right, once we entered the clinical trial. That's way too late. We need to have a discussion with regulatory bodies in the beginning. We need to have a discussion with healthcare providers in the beginning. Then certainly basic research comes in terms of understanding mechanisms and really nailing it down what we want to target. And the unique thing that we have in university medicine is we can then go very fast, considering the regulatory framework, into patients and eventually go back and forth and try to understand is what we had intended actually doing what it should do, and then come to a large scale. That is something that big pharma can at the moment not do. Big pharma basically freezes at an early stage and then goes all the way through. I think there are also different role models at the moment developing in translation. What are the challenges, or some of the major challenges? We have in university medicine at the moment a lot of infrastructures, but not all of them are really optimized for translational purposes. We have a very DRG-oriented budgeting, that's more the German term, or how we are very positioned in Germany, of clinical performance. That's a major denominating factor according to which clinician and clinical fellows are judged and how their performance is looked into. Research is mainly impact factor or citation factor oriented in research performance. Both are not really identical to anything that is a translational oriented budgeting and assessment. On a complete different level, Big Pharma is retracting from many aspects of doing research themselves and is much more understanding themselves in a complete different role nowadays compared to how they have been earlier. And MedTech sees Germany as a low-budget market at the moment, and other fields and other areas, and you mentioned why translation happens other places, are more attractive. In those challenges, there are also opportunities. Some of the boundary conditions are changing. We have the new game, what I indicated just now. So far, basic and disease-specific research was done and then handed over to pharma that would make it available to people. Nowadays, pharma probably, or a number of industries, see themselves much more as investors into research ideas, ideally in a very late stage when they already are ready to go to market, or where they actually have healthcare providers already on board, so you know that you don't make any mistake anymore, it's completely de-risked. We have also new legislations, just two mentioned here. The ATMP has revolutionized the way how cellular therapies or advanced therapies in general are made available. And also the very recent change that MDR for medical devices is completely new in Europe, and the US will follow. And those constraints give new opportunities and new possibilities. And you need to be aware of those, and you need to know them as early as possible if you start your research. A great possibility, I believe, is that the classical differentiation between the different fields is vanishing. Research morphs with development, morphs with approval, morphs with reimbursement, and later usages. The boundaries between the different stages are more and more falling apart. And that becomes even more clear if we think about cellular products that we're providing in university hospitals or in hospitals. If we think about 3D printing of devices or of scaffolds or of implants. If we think about advanced diagnostics that are only available at very dedicated points and linked to very specific knowledge, and certainly wearable technologies that open completely new ways of direct interaction of doctors and patients in a complete different manner and different possibilities. Big data has been mentioned a couple of times, is a big topic and changes and a big game changer anyway. Just as an example, the flagship project that we're trying at the moment to finalize, and we got this 1 million funding from the European Commission to basically show that the classical small molecules and the biologic therapies have tried to allow a chronic therapy over a long period of time. We have now entering the stage, the living drugs, the cellular products or the combinational products, the ATMPs. They try to actually be game changer by coming from treating chronically to really regeneration and restoring. So basically really getting rid of the core problem. The complexity is dramatically increasing. Just one example from our house, an immune-based therapy where we completely reboot the immune system in a young boy and have a chance to actually completely restore the possibilities and also life possibilities for that young boy. Or another example for bone defect regeneration, where we have an infection situation, the bone defect is, the bone is gone, we have a 3D printing realized with a commercial partner, but then healing was really happening, we mechanobiologically optimized the scaffold, and in the end have actually shown that we can, with that little optimization, actually optimize healing and bounce healing forward. It's going back and forth, try out, and find opportunities. In the end, it's de-risking, fail early and quickly, but scientists don't fail. As a scientist, you don't fail. And probably that's something we really have to think about. Other fields are a little bit smarter in that. They do have failure as an integral part of education and going forward. Mindset of translation requires that we have really a scientific culture that identifies translation potential early, tries them out, and goes forward. For that, we need education, we need structured clinician scientist program, but with that, I don't mean a clinician scientist will be the best biochemist. I mean, those people could be like what Mark Furman showed, pathology finders, understand patient needs much better and come to a biological understanding. We need performance indicators that matches the other performance indicators, and we certainly need an endpoint positions for those who are engaged and active in going towards a translational career, be it as a clinician scientist, be it as a basic scientist, because the competition at the moment for the best brains and the best possible career opportunities are needed for those best brains. All that goes together with something that we're very eagerly looking into in Berlin with a quest ensuring the quality and the awareness of the reproducibility of the results and the ethical requirements. All that requires also that we can talk about the failures and the experiences that we have had and publish those in an adequate manner. Mindset alone is not enough. We need adequate infrastructure to do that, otherwise translation will not happen. With adequate infrastructure, I don't only mean core units. We need core units, and they will always change with the technology and how that develops forwards. We need also infrastructure and structures that allow an early engagement of relevant partners that are the patients, that are the other affected representatives, that are the regulatory bodies, that are the healthcare providers. We initiated a dialogue with one of the largest healthcare providers here. Simply learning the language helps so much to understand what actually everybody talks about. We need structures to prioritize because translation is expensive. What do we really carry forward, and what do we carry forward with the person who invented it, and what do we not carry forward because it is not really going to a success and we don't really de-risk. Translation requires a continuous monitoring of the risk, and that's also part of the game. And in the end, prioritization some of those features and directions and probably drop other ideas that sounded great in the beginning but will have a chance to actually make it in the end. All that requires certainly funding, and we talked about that, and that's something which we really need to also address. We have great funding mechanisms in Germany and Europe. We have opportunities, but a lot of those are rather role models or are intended to produce role models. But if a role model works, how do we then bring the next pharmacon, the next advanced therapies through such a mechanism, and how do we really optimize infrastructures to do that? I'd like to wrap up. I'm realizing it's a little earlier, so I don't know how much I get. We have formulated a lot of those ideas and thoughts in DFG. In the DFG paper, you may read it up if you want to. It is really about taking risk, but also trying to understand the risk, build a team, have the people and the competences, and usually not everybody has all the competences. You need people, you need a team, and you need to have the team working together for a long period of times. You need to have an understanding of clinical affairs and the approval processes, health economics, and regulatory environment, and the healthcare providers, and bring them on board. And you need to early on identify the opportunities and the risks in your idea and the freedom of operation. That's not only writing a pattern, that's much more than that. And in that sense, between infrastructure and mindset, I think if we have that in place and there are very good role models, then I think we have a good chance to translate and really come to the goal that we reach the patient and actually make it possible. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you both. And now we come to statements of our panelists. And the first, you deserved it. Actually, he needs 3 of them because he made good 3 minutes. So we come to statements of our panelists. And Veronika von Messling will start. And you said the German government supports translational health research so that patients can benefit from innovations more rapidly and effectively. There is, however, no one-size-fits-all solution. Translational challenges need to be tackled on an individual level. So the question is, what do you mean by individual level here? Or what is the thrust of your statement?
Well, I think that we, as a government, our role is to do the things that our constituents can't do by themselves. And I think research and education, so our ministry, is a prime example for that. Research is really what is going to determine the quality of our future lives. And so no one individual can do this by themselves. That's why the government invests heavily in these aspects. But when it comes, but when it comes to health research, at the end, the patient, the end user, is at the center of those efforts. And our health is very diverse. And so I think we all agree that there's not going to be this one way, this one institute, this one approach that will provide the solution, the answer to our challenges in healthcare. And this is why it is important to recognize the diversity and then figure out how can we either enable underlying processes or how can we design strategies that address the individual aspects of the challenge in an appropriate way.
So do you think we need different types of institutions tackle different areas of translation, or do you think of a network of such institutions working together, or what would be your vision?
I think it's more of a plug and play. I think we have to look at what is the problem or what is the solution that we are trying to develop, and then what does it need to bring this solution across all the different obstacles, a little bit like some kind of obstacle course. And it starts from the discovery, is it actually worth a development, or is it a discovery that is part of a larger process that ultimately will lead to a development. Then if we develop it, what does it actually need to be developed? Which stakeholders do we need to bring to the table? I don't think it's one university or one scientist. I think we need maybe industrial partners at different levels. We will need core facilities, but we will maybe need clinics that have special knowledge on this disease, and we have to tailor-make our approach to the product or to the solution that we are trying to develop. And I think another aspect really is from the beginning to look at, are we developing something somebody actually wants to use? What is our idea? Does it match with expectations? We need to bring the end users into the dialogue early on, very much that what was said from the beginning. It's not just us, the scientists, or us, the doctors, or the developers. It's also us, the human beings that are who are eventually going to be recipients of all this.
Okay, thank you very much. And I come to Bernd Stowasser. He said, Europe has great science, but not enough support for translational research. Improving this should be Europe's mission. So can you please allude on that? What do you think by not enough support?
Yeah, I would first refer to the two outstanding presentations we had at the beginning of this session. And ultimately, and this is where my activities mainly focus, so obviously many of us view things from where we really try to impact the system, is really at the edge between the application of an innovation and the discovery of the innovation. Means that I really see a lot of activities where we get promising approaches somewhere, and Professor Duda alluded that obviously not all the translational research is happening in industry. This is not new. In fact, this happened really, I can say, at least in the 30 years of experience I have in industry. And it becomes more and more difficult to find the best ways out of a discovery, which is already an early innovation, but it really becomes an innovation when and you said this, when it ends up with a patient. And and Professor Duda made one point where you say, okay, industry is buying phase 2, phase 3 stage projects. It's not as simple anymore because there are not many around and the costs have gone through the sky. And this is mainly because we need to find better ways really to decide what products, what targets we want to put forward, what clinical trials we want to engage, rather than finding out of a costly phase 3 trial that we really don't meet the primary endpoints. And that's why I think it is a responsibility of all of us who are active in this fantastic European ecosystem. And I'm a lot in the US because my role is global, so I see the US and really Europe, and I can compare a lot. We have a unique advantage through public-private partnership collaboration in Europe. And IMI1, IMI2 have been extremely successful endeavors. And now we are looking...
Maybe you explain what IMI stands for?
Yeah. Actually, again, this is always the small glasses you have on your eyes. I apologize for that. It is a 5.3 billion euro program by the European Commission and the EFPIA. The EFPIA is basically, you could say, the reunion of the pharmaceutical industry in Europe, but also global players are there. It's a 50-50 share of the ownership. So the European Commission pays European researchers to engage in the projects, while pharma industry is in fact not getting money. They put resources into this. So overall a value of over 2.5 billion comes from pharma, not as money, but as headcount. And so this has so far delivered almost 140 successful European projects and consortia with incredible results. And actually, I just come back from a kickoff meeting from Spain, Granada, where we have the largest immunology translational project just started. It's called the 3TR project. And ultimately, it is a non-competitive research platform, and the European Commission representative Martin Seychell said clearly, it is a collaboration between pharma, between academics, between biotech, between regulators. And this is really what you find in the IMI platform.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that Uli Dirnagl is also involved in an IMI project on quality. Maybe he can tell us about it. And Uli, you said translational success critically depends on a robust, rigorous, and transparent research. As a researcher, I could say, isn't that obvious, and isn't that everyday practice?
Unfortunately not. So I would say preclinical research is the fundament of clinical development in the model that we are talking about. Preclinical research, at least in the academic setting, is up to pharmacology, toxicology is non-regulated. And the academic setup, in fact, is set up to incentivize publications, particularly in high-impact journals and third-party funding. But this type of incentives generates an environment which unfortunately also sees, I think, selective use of data, non-publication of data. No, we don't see the negative ones, low statistical power, lots of bias by, well, not randomizing, not blinding. We also see a lot of external validity, which is rather low. So I'm referring to the white, healthy male inbred mouse strains that we use. In general, this has a tendency to produce false positives and also inflated effect sizes. And I'm not just claiming this. We see the effects of it. The industry has blown the whistle that they cannot reproduce what we do in academia. Now that we see systematic reproduction initiatives, like, for example, the Cancer Reproducibility Project, if we are lucky, we see a reproducibility of pivotal findings of, well, 50% if it's high, of high-level findings. So at the same time, regulators and IRBs are not vetting preclinical efficacy, let alone quality. We know this because they don't have the information. Because Daniel Streich did a study where he was looking in Germany at investigator brochures. This is the basis for these vetting processes, and they just don't contain the relevant information. So I would posit that if we at least have a tendency to have non-robust results, and if those results are not properly vetted, how could we expect that they then successfully translate into human therapies? Just my last point, because I was now focusing on preclinical, we see in a way similar problems in the clinical realm, less or just a little bit less than 40%, no, actually a little bit less than 50% of clinical trials from academia never get published. They are not there of completed studies. They never get published. And we know this from a study where we were benchmarking the 36 German university medical centers, including the Charité, which was just also there with the same number. I think it's fair to say, and there's also some evidence for it, that the reason for non-publication are results that just did not turn out to be the ones that we were expecting. So again, with non-robust evidence, how can we hope that these phase 2, mostly phase 2 trials that are done in academia, how can they properly inform phase 3 studies then? So these are all, if you wish, bad news, but I'll give you the good news, and I think I'm serious, I think it's really good news. The real good news is that these things are on the table. We know them, and I think they're easily fixed. I mean, we can start, actually we have started, and not just us, but I think there is a movement now, and there's some appreciation of the problems, and we are tackling them now. And I'm pretty optimistic that we see the fallout of these activities in the near future. And the IMI project that you were mentioning is one, and I also see this as a very positive sign. Industry is complaining that they have a problem with our results, and so industry and academia in this particular project, 29 partners are working together to straighten this out. So I'm optimistic.
Any comment?
Well, yes, I mean, I like to pick up again on the IMI because this is something, of course, we are already very much designing the successor to the IMI. A number of decisions have already been taken, for example, to expand this also to other industries, the medtech industry in particular, because we see that the future is going to be also a linkage and a joining up of technologies, to actually link diagnostics, for example, with therapeutics, etc. And also, let's not forget the data dimension, so also the rapidly expanding new world of medical ICT, which needs to be also embedded in products. And obviously, the other aspect we're working on is also how to improve the bridging with the public authorities, because one of the biggest obstacles potentially to research is if you have solutions that cannot easily be absorbed and utilized because the systems are not prepared for them. You cannot easily graft a new solution onto an old system. And therefore, we have to do this in parallel. We have to start preparing the ground for the technology. When it comes through, we'll find a fertile environment. This is really important because otherwise we lose a lot of time until that environment can be modified. And when I say environment, it's not just those running the kind of politically or administratively responsible for health systems. You have to engage, for example, with the professionals. We have seen many examples of technologies that have not found taken root because the professionals were not prepared for them. And were not involved in their design. For example, the aspects which are important from a professional's point of view. And last but certainly not least, the patients. We've been doing a lot of work, for example, to understand what patients see as desirable outcomes. We talk about unmet needs. Unmet needs are not just medical in terms of purely, parameters, but also the quality of life expectation. There's a huge area there of unmet needs when it comes to quality of life. That can all be fed through, and the advantage of a lot of these new technologies we have today is that they are very malleable. You can actually design them for certain performance characteristics, and that's something we should definitely exploit together. Okay,
if you were just saying prices for different steps in the translation go through the ceiling. So on what level is this the real problem? Is it phase 2, phase 3 studies, or are already the ideas which are de-risked to some degree and you have to buy them, so to speak, from academia or whatever? Where do you see the main pricing or cost issue? Yeah. Because at the end it has to be payable by the community.
Yeah, extremely good question and difficult question. I think I will definitely answer the question, but before I really come to the point, I would like to, because in a discussion like this, you have different views, you have different, so I think from my perspective, one focus is really the collaboration we have in Europe between the different stakeholders. And this is really an advantage we have, at least against the US, and also against, I would say, areas like China. By collaboration, I mean that we engage with our headcount, while in the US it's much more the model that people pay and the NIH makes things. We have in Europe much more a dialogue between really the stakeholders. And we learn this through long collaborations between industry first, then just things like dialogue between the member states and the European Commission and the EFPIA. We went through a lengthy process, and now we really can take a lot of benefit. And now I come to really the question you asked. I think the problem starts early. When you, in the research and development process, when you set on the wrong horse at the beginning, you create incredible cost at the end. And that's why the more knowledge we have about the disease, and this is where the problem is arising, that we do not have enough information on the individual disease. And that is where we can really gain a huge progress when we collaborate, in fact, between the academic partners and the industry and the regulators. The problem at the moment is, in fact, and I apologize for saying this openly. Academia is engaging incredibly well. Biotech is doing this. Who is not engaging appropriately in this are the regulators. So we very often have them as a viewer and saying, you make your thing, but we would expect some active contribution to solve the problem, not observing the solution of the problem.
Prof. Messling, that's probably not something which falls into your domain, so you are quite happy here. But on the other hand, what falls into the domain of research funding is obviously what kind of parameters are you looking at. And Georg Duda said that already, that it might create, or certainly the parameters on which you measure success in your funding schemes are creating a certain mindset. So do you consider to change that, or is it well established, or do you see it's a problem?
I think part of this is correct. If the funding, and I don't think it's the funders that are the problem. I think the entire scientific system is a basic research, is a system that's designed to foster basic research successes. And so the criteria that we have established in the academic success assessment have grown gradually, and they may or may not fit what we think is a translational, much more collaborative, integrative environment. But what I usually say then is that I am not hiring heads of departments. And I'm not the person sitting in the board and deciding that the person with 10 Nature papers gets this job and not the person who did 2 successful clinical trials. So I think what we need is, we do need a redefinition of who are the people we want to lead these endeavors, and what are the CVs, the careers that we want to foster. And yes, the funders have to enable this type of career, and I think we already heard about the clinician scientist, advanced clinician scientist. We have to let's say, build a pool of that type of highly qualified personnel. But then it's also up to the academic system to hire these people, to think that this is the right director for my institution, and to figure out. And I think we as a scientific community have to figure out what makes an excellent translational scientist and what maybe makes a poor translational scientist. Very much like we define what makes an excellent basic researcher versus what maybe makes somebody who doesn't do so great. Because the argument that everybody who does translation is automatically great, I don't think holds water. Mm-hmm.
Georg, I think that's something for you to comment, because you are in an institution who you are in the BIH, but also in the Regenerative Medicine institution, which tries to foster exactly this mindset.
I mean, the mindset that we try to have in our institutions is one thing. What I'd like to comment is also, it's not only how to hire people, it's also the culture of reviews and sort of how we look into grant proposals that colleagues send, and how do we review internally. And is translation mattering, or are we in the end looking for the impact factor and we simply look for the paper quality? And from that, then transfer should that be funded or not. And we're realizing that sort of the impact for the citation are relevant features, and even if we ask our students in the graduate school who should get this kickbox funding, so small funding, they are much more looking easily for the sort of countable measures than really looking into what is the proposal. It's more complicated. Really read it, really go through the details, try to understand the technology, and I think that's also what you mean from the industry perspective, to understand what is really behind an idea. And that's more complicated than the conventional way how we have so far looked into science in our field and how we judged about performances. So review is an additional feature that comes in.
Well, everyone wants to take a simple approach, and the impact factor, everyone says the impact factor is completely improper to judge people, but we do it quite often in our institutions, I must confess, because it's relatively difficult to convince other people that there are more important parameters for the future success. As you said, if you jump on the wrong horse, you may not end where you want to end, but it's very difficult to know it in the beginning.
Probably just one element that's, to me personally, very important, also what we try to position with that DFG paper. I think in life science we need both. We need people who really want to do purely basic science and don't really, that even may not be interested in translating that. And then there are those who want to translate. And I think it's also about honesty and how seriously we really mean certain directions. And what I would strongly try to avoid is that now, because there is more funding, and we have seen that in the British system, there's more funding coming with translation, so you all jump and you all claim you make translation, but that's not honest. So do really what you want to do, but then do that fully, and that refers to how the funding mechanisms goes. That also refers to how do you review things and how do you estimate possibilities.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important point. I think we should not underestimate also the importance of the basic research, because it's impossible to predict what the needs of tomorrow will be. I mean, I mentioned earlier the problem of infectious diseases. Well, you know, some years ago, anyone doing research, I don't know, on viral hemorrhagic fevers was very much kind of a sideline, some exotic area. Suddenly, you know, we realized we needed products, technologies, vaccines, antivirals, and so on. And it was a very good thing that there were people who understood something about, you know, viruses like Ebola and so on. Now, you have no way in healthcare of predicting everything. Some things we know will come. They're already, you know, you can predict that. But the needs in a decade or two, so we also need to have a right balance between, you know, and in fact, the Horizon Europe program, like previous research programs, addresses both aspects. There is space for the pure research, basic research, but also then we recognize we need to be much better also at translating the results and taking that into the real world context. But you need both. Very much so.
But how do you balance? Because it's very difficult to, when you look from the end, there's always a tendency to say we need this kind of outcome, we need this kind of solution for this problem, funding the grassroots activities, which in the end will provide the brilliant ideas for the problem, but you don't even know the problem. Solving unknown problems is much more difficult.
Mean, sometimes what happens is at that level, you know problems at a much more macro level. So you know that, for example, we are facing certain problems. I'll give other examples. I mean, we have, for example, say a growing problem. We know that multimorbidity, polypharmacy issues, which the current model does not handle very well. But there's a lot of very basic research that needs to be done there to understand. So to move to a new model, for example, of analyzing, assessing products in combination. Now, that is not something which can be exploited in the next few years. You know, there's a lot of things we do not know about that. But that could revolutionize the way we do not just pharmaceutical development, but even toxicology, for example, how we understand these things. But that is an area, you know, you see that there is a problem, but it's a much more macro level. You cannot define it. Whereas when we talk about unmet needs, very often we talk about very specific unmet needs. You know, we don't have, I don't know, appropriate treatments for pancreatic cancer of a certain type. That is a pretty well-defined problem which you can actually apply the models. But when we know that there are gaps, areas where we do not have sufficient understanding, you need also to fund the basic and improve the basic understanding of that problem first.
And do you think a kind of digital modeling of humans, like this avatar or digital twin approach, will help in that direction?
That will help, but also, you know, we need also to use all the data sources. I mean, the example mentioned is a very good one. In science, you know, as we've heard, nothing is ever really a failure. I mean, you learn also from things that don't work out in the way you expected them to work out. The point is, are we learning from that? Or are we continuing to plow the same furrow, as we would say, you know, basically pouring more money into the same approach? I mean, we know, for example, it's a struggle to develop new treatments for, say, neurodegenerative diseases. You know, there have been some dramatic, you know, let's say we'd call them failures. I don't call them failures because if we learn from that and say we need to try something different now, we need to look at maybe a different angle, that is something a researcher needs to know. If that information is hidden away somewhere, it's not accessible because it was labeled as a failure, then we risk yet another failure of the same type. So actually, creating a space where we can have this data available and also to use the data from health systems themselves. I mean, registries, for example, is an area where we are very much at work. Cancer, rare diseases are all, this is where you need critical mass. You need to have as much data as possible. Europe should be in a very strong position. 450 million people, we should be one of the biggest data sets anywhere. I mean, our health systems are as close to universal access as anywhere on the planet.
If the regulators allow us.
So we should, and that's what we should work on. Yes, we should allow that. Of course, with the right safeguards.
Yeah. Uli, we come to the round of opportunities, and you heard the comment about also using data from unsuccessful trials, and you were already addressing that. So where do you see the big opportunities for the coming years?
Well, I mean, directly addressing your question, but then I also want to make a more general point. Directly addressing your question, again, as I said, I think it's a pretty, at least in principle, much of the things are no-brainers. If you talk about making failures to successes, we need to learn about the failures. That means we need to publish them, we need to make them public. Also, I should mention that failures, there's a famous saying that to be successful, translation must fail. And that what's meant by this is that failures, and I would call them good failures, are probing sort of the space of opportunity. And so, for example, from a failed study, you can learn that this dosage doesn't work, but another one, or this timing of a treatment doesn't work, but maybe then you try another one. So in a way it's trivial, but if we don't learn about these failures, then we have a problem, and that's solved by incentivizing publication of those failures. It is, I think, a strong role of the regulators to really check what we are doing in terms of, this is particular for the clinical trials. I think it should be also considered for preclinical, that is pre-registration of those studies. And then once they are pre-registered and concluded, someone needs to check whether the results get into the domain of either the public domain in general or in particular of researchers. So a lot of these things, I think, are pretty straightforward, but they need kind of a joint effort from regulators, from funders. Funders are extremely important. They have a very strong role in this because they can just say, well, if you don't do this or that, I mean, you can do whatever you want, but you won't get my money if you don't do that. So I think if, for example, the BMBF puts more sort of conditionality in some of their, like the Wellcome does it, and also the NIH has started to do it. These are measures that are, I think, that would be very, very successful. Maybe I can add one new thought in this, and it's really not very original, but it's coming from a different direction. If there were a formula, I mean, in a way, there was an elephant, and there's kind of another elephant in this room, and this is the formula for translation. Like, there is one. We're looking for one. We're discussing it. We're trying to find it. And I guess most of us would agree there is no formula for translation. Otherwise, we would already have it. I mean, this is an old topic. A lot of money has been poured into it. The NIH has a specific agency for it. The NCATs, they have a budget of 1.4 billion. So, I mean, if it were that easy, we would already know the solution. I see two, but on the other hand, we still discuss it because we are not happy with the results. One thing why we don't see results, I think, is the sheer complexity of the problem, and that the low-hanging fruits in many of those areas have been picked. So, and that adds to this complexity. This, we can just say, well, that's it, but we can't make complexity easier because it's there. So we should, I think, concentrate on those bottlenecks, hurdles, or whatever that we can influence. And there, I think, it's everything, and this is permeating the discussion, but I just want to emphasize it. This is about the environment. This is about the ecosystem in which this type of research is happening. And I see three things that we need on a very general level. One is competence. Competence is, and on all levels, basic research, just like in clinical. So, and that has to do with education. It needs capability. And capability not only includes agencies like cores and stuff like that. It includes that people have the time to do stuff like that. We did a survey at the Charité about translational culture. Everyone wants to do translation. They tick this on a Likert scale of 5, they all want to do it. But when you ask them, do you have the time to do it? Do you get the support from your institution to do it? They tick on the left side of the bar. It's clear because they are in clinical duties, they do teaching and all those things. So we need to provide capability, and then we need to provide motivation. That's the third thing. And the motivation, this is where those, and it also was mentioned several times now, are the incentives in the system. I don't know whether there are clear indicators like numbers that we can put to it, but we must appreciate these different kinds of outputs that are generated from null results to the cell paper is beautiful, it's wonderful. But we also need to tell people, hey, it's great if your data is in the public domain, you have a study that didn't do what you actually wanted it to do or to show, but nevertheless you have put it into the public or in the scientific discussion. So that's on the motivation part. And all the discussion that I observe here in this panel, in papers, wherever I go, they always sort of rotate around these three things. And this is where we have to get to work.
Mr. Stowasser, do you see it like Uli does it, or does the industry have the solution? Uli said there are lots of people trying to do it, and I think industry is throwing quite an amount of money and efforts on it. So where do you see the solution?
Yeah, I think I have very little to disagree with what Ulrich said, and I would add, in fact, for the translational aspect, that the dialogue and the collaboration between people with different expertise is really key. And that's why we need platforms for that, because this does not come on its own. That is hard work, really, to bring people together. So I learned this in a long way, just industry talking to each other. That was the start of public-private partnership. And you can say, well, industries, they should know their language, they speak to each other. No, it was a long way of building trust, of building platforms where we can collaborate. Then we brought academics, biotechs, regulators on board. Now, and it was said by our representative from the European Commission, now we extend this to other industries. And again here, this is not a given. When you talk between, let's say, pharma and medtech, or pharma and IT, it is very often a completely different language, a different expectation, timelines, milestones they want to see, definition of collaborative space. This will take a long effort. And this is actually one of the reasons, one of the things Europe should do, on top of what was said, to really enforce this collaboration and find a decent platform for it where everybody feels comfortable.
And you already said that you see Europe here in a specific position because we are used to talk to each other across boundaries, or
yeah, I would say that we did, at least in the past 10 years, a very hard work to get to this point. Again, this did not come on its own. And here we have, I think, a huge advantage against other regions in the world, where many of the interactions are really focused on individual projects, are focused on one gives money, the other is doing what he's doing anyway. And so we really actively collaborate. I'm a member of the Research and Innovation Strategy Group by the EFPIA, who is also involved in the preparation of those new public-private partnerships. You cannot imagine how many hours I just spent on this to ensure that we are cozier and EFPIA is aligned, and then we need to, of course, talk to the institutions in the public sector so that Charité and other universities get the information and give the right feedback when there is an inquiry by the Commission on feedback. And just one experience I had recently in a dialogue with Google. So it's probably well known that Sanofi, actually I'm not here as a Sanofi member today, I'm more EFPIA, but in Sanofi that we have a collaboration with Google, so the Verily subsidiary. Once in a while I'm engaging in discussion with them and try to explain to them not only the project we have with them, which is really business oriented, but also other things. You have no idea how difficult that is. People very quickly stop to listen to you when you lose the profit and money and earnings sector. So when you say, let's collaborate on something which has not an immediate return of investment, immediately you get no ears on that. So people really just stop conversation. And this is something where if we do this in Europe, we might have a huge advantage to break that borders between sectors which have really not a good dialogue today.
Prof. Messling, that's certainly something where you are much freer. You don't have to look for the immediate return on investment. So where do you see the role of the federal ministry for research with respect to future chances in the area?
Well, I think you pay taxes. You would be quite upset as taxpayer if you felt that I wasn't looking at return on investment. So we may not look...
Not money-wise, but...
Yeah, but much more important. Like, I think our return on investment is benefit to the people, which I think we are all interested in. So I think the point that is really, I think, coming through also again and again is the aspect that this idea that one individual or one entity would be able to lead some development across the entire cycle is being replaced with the realization that there have to be handovers. So it's more like, and this requires an understanding of our partners and a respect for their respective expertise. And if we are, as funders, if we are able to create an environment and incentives that enable that type of handover and that type of mutual respect and recognition of each individual's contribution, then I think we can address many of the points that were brought up, and we can also eliminate periods of inefficient interaction that cost time, because what also was one of the points that was raised is why does it take so incredibly long from this wonderful discovery that might actually be reproducible to something that I can get when I am about to die or if I'm really sick. And there's parts of this where there's nothing we can do, because in contrast to many other things, if we talk about health products, and here I have to defend the regulators a little bit, the next stop, if a regulator gives approval, is a patient. And so the barrier is much higher than by many other products where I buy it, it doesn't work, I throw it away. So here, I buy it, it doesn't work, oops, the patient has a bigger problem than he had or she had before. So there's periods that we cannot shorten at the moment with the technology that we have, but where we can really make or get bang for the buck is if we succeed in shortening the time that where a product is not being developed. And that is something where I think funders can have impact, and I think also dialogue, like some kind of directed exchange between the different groups, can also really contribute at shortening that, because that has no added value. That is just time we lose. Whereas other things, I think we just have to face it. It takes time to show that something is safe and efficacious, no matter how much money we throw at it.
Can I just add to that, because I have to commend the ministry, and I'm very serious about this. You have not mentioned it, but I will mention it. The BMBF in this respect, I think, is very innovative. With respect to this particular discussion here, on my mind, there are two specific calls or sets of calls that the ministry has, which I think are totally innovative and critical in this sense. One is the validation call, which enables projects to do this step towards validating the target validation thing, and the other one, which is spectacular because no one in the world has a call like this. It's the preclinical confirmation call. I mentioned in the beginning, I said we have this problem of reproducibility and we are not reproducing. Why aren't we not doing it? Because we don't get money for it. It's very hard for a specific researcher to reproduce something. And so we have always argued, well, we can't do it. But now there was this call, and I think there's the final selection now of projects where there is specific money for groups to work together to see whether something is real and worth while taking further into a clinical development. So I think that there are very concrete funding mechanisms that can be, besides just asking you should do this and that, there are very concrete funding mechanisms, and they are already in place. And since I'm commending funders, I would like to commend the EU as well, because in terms of open science and responsible and the RRI, responsible research in
and innovation
is I think just a very important initiative and will help everyone with similar goals that we're discussing here to do better work. So that's why I said I'm optimistic. Very surprising to Axel, I guess. That I'm
very
so
surprising, but you said we don't have the formula, but we have ingredients for the formula already, and there's something changing. So, Georg, how do you see it from your experience, for instance, in the Research Law Initiative? Is the European scientific and broader community, the stakeholders, are they ready for translation, ready to change the mindset?
I think new technologies like advanced therapies have a chance to sort of give new pathways and new possibilities. And yes, certainly we are ready anyway with that Restore initiative, and we would be happy to get going. The question, I think, it's also here about like opportunities and what are remaining probably, or how could we increase opportunities? And that's something what I liked also in your statement. I couldn't even dream about that you sort of extend IMI towards not only pharma, but having the medtech companies, because they are, even most of them are smaller size and mid-size. They are in total one of the largest sort of ecosystems in Europe that we have, that really substantially supports and pays the taxes and helps to get things real and made. What I would like to sort of question is, you're great. We are great in Europe to harmonize and get things together. Yet in the approval regulatory side, we briefly discussed about that, we have certain things that run relatively straight, like in the ATMPs and in EMA. We have now with the MDR a new regulation that is much more complicated, and specifically for devices or solutions that are between the two, or take some elements from the one or the other, or even go to the IT perspective, it's getting more and more complicated. Wouldn't it be helpful to harmonize that, even not make it easier, but sort of make it more transparent, or the sort of more science and oriented than probably some of the elements are at the moment?
I mean, you mentioned the medical devices regulations. I mean, of course, the implementation is still unfolding, and we are aware there are quite a few challenges. But let's not forget also what led to that regulation also in the first place. I mean, we managed to stave off a situation which could have been catastrophic, because with the scandals that there were, and you know, this was a very small fraction of the whole sector, but it became. We discovered some structural weaknesses, for example, in certain notified bodies that were being designated by certain member states, clearly not up to the job. So there's been a sharp reduction now in the number of, that obviously has some impact until the situation settles down. But I think one point I definitely agree with you is we need to make sure that we also support transitions of this nature. So that's something, you know, it's not enough just to say, you know, the new rules enter into force and they are maybe, you know, stronger and more robust than the previous ones. We also need to, when you have such a major transition, we also need to see what's the best way to support. I think, you know, I'd like to make a quick point also, because the strengths of Europe were mentioned. I think one of the things which is often underestimated about Europe is our ability to bring different interests together. This is something we do every day. Maybe, you know, people who are not involved in the engine room of this machine don't see this, but every day experts on various fields and from different sectors come together to address a whole host of issues. We have a lot of experience with harmonization, standardization, interoperability. These things we do every day on all kinds of things. We can create structures, etc. I'll give you an example which is very relevant for the topic we're discussing today. On rare diseases, we have created, in a few years, the European reference networks. So brought together all the centers of excellence, over 900 centers, and there's another call right now, on 24 rare disease categories. All diseases are covered by these 24 categories. Now, the system is up and running. There are patients being referred there. We have the data can be exchanged in secure ways. All that is done. This is an excellent environment for research, an excellent environment also to do clinical trials. So we have something which is there, ready, done, and it was done for a very modest investment. Yeah. Why? Because a few million from the health program per year, literally single digits, millions. I mean, not tens of millions or hundreds. And this was done because the member states realized that critical mass was important. We brought in the hospital managers, etc. And so now the challenge is, how do we use that infrastructure? It's there, and we have other examples, registries, for example. We have, with the help of the Joint Research Center of the Commission, we are looking at registries, cancer, rare diseases. What should the registries of the future look like? What is the kind of information which needs to be there? And how can you have interoperability between all the European registries that exist, so that a researcher does not have to worry about where the data is. The data will remain where it is, but can be accessed as a single data set in a correct way. That is something we can easily do. If there is the will to do it, it can be done. It has, we already have quite some experience with that. What we need to identify is exactly what is the kind of information that researchers need. That is what we need to do.
Thank you very much. A very last word by
Just a quick
Georg.
do you see a chance to include in that also the healthcare providers? Because that's the only unit at the moment. I mean, they are not at the table here, but they are highly important.
They are absolutely
and the
essential.
sort of differentiation in Europe is extreme.
Absolutely essential.
I think the stakeholder idea is very, very relevant, and we heard that we might be good in Europe in including them from the basic scientists to the patients, with the funders, with the healthcare providers. So I thank you all very much on behalf of the Biomed Alliance. I think, it is worth an applause. And with that, I hand over to Christoph von Kalle, who will introduce the keynote speaker of this afternoon. Thank you very much.